it became very clear to me that governments were seeing the increase of GDP and the associated obsession with creating a business-friendly investment climate was a distraction from the real thing, which is to improve the well-being of the population and to combat poverty more effectively. And so the question really is not about whether GDP increase is a good or a bad thing per se. It's about how we achieve it, at which cost, using which tools, with which impacts, and with which safeguards to ensure that it remains a means towards an end and not an end in itself.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Equals, the really cool podcast about inequality. And my name's Max.
And I'm Annie.
Annie, we haven't done this podcast together for ages. Feels like forever. So how have you been? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, relatively well, but also, kind of depressed about what's happening here in Latin America with far-right candidates winning elections lately.
Yeah, I mean, it feels the same here in the UK, that with reform miles ahead in the polls, and then in Europe, it seems everywhere the far right is really winning, isn't it? It's quite hard to be hopeful at this point. But I think with this podcast and the next one, we're going to try and do that. We're going to try and bring some hope into the world. That's our plan.
Yes, some hope and a different vision for the future. And that's exactly what we're going to discuss today. We have Olivier De Schutter, who's going to talk about his roadmap for eradicating poverty beyond growth, which he presented when he was the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, and worked on it with a really broad alliance of UN agencies and member states, trade unions, grassroots movements, and academics.
Yeah, it's a really big achievement, isn't it? It's a really, really great vision, and we're going to get into that today. And then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking to the team behind another really influential report released recently, the Global Justice Report by the Paris School of Economics by Thomas Piketty and his team. So and Olivier spoke at the launch of that too. So they're very much closely linked and very powerful visions of a better future, which we'll hope will cheer us up a bit. So shall we get into it?
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that both reports, say we really need to go beyond GDP growth, have a big focus on inequality and on climate justice. So I think it'll be a very interesting 2-part series.
Great, let's do it.
Olivier, thank you so much for joining us on Equals today. It's great to have you here. So you've spent decades fighting poverty, but your recent work, your 2024 report to the Human Rights Council specifically, suggests that the old playbook is fundamentally broken. What made you realize we have to stop chasing GDP growth? This just isn't working.
Well, you see, in the country visits that we do as special rapporteurs, we have the opportunity to interact with government officials and to ask them what they are doing to combat poverty and to press on them certain suggestions. And I was really struck by the fact that in many cases, my calls for example, investing more in social protection, for raising the wages of low-income workers, for taxing corporations at a higher level in order to improve financing of health and education, all these requests I was making systematically met with a rebuke because they were considered to be against growth and to make the country less attractive to investors, to weaken its competitive position on global markets. And it became very clear to me that governments were seeing the increase of GDP and the associated obsession with creating a business-friendly investment climate was a distraction from the real thing, which is to improve the well-being of the population and to combat poverty more effectively. And so the question naturally arose about why this was having such a grip on the imagination of decision makers, why growing the GDP was such an obsession and was perceived as a precondition for everything else. I should immediately add, however, that there are both illegitimate and legitimate reasons to want to grow the economy. What is illegitimate, of course, is to try to attract investors by lowering the standards, weakening regulations, lowering taxes on corporate profits. But what is legitimate is the desire to reimburse a foreign debt by growing the economy and to grow the economy in order to provide better infrastructures to the population, build schools, hospitals, and so on. And so the question really is not about whether GDP increase is a good or a bad thing per se. It's about how we achieve it, at which cost, using which tools, with which impacts and with which safeguards to ensure that it remains a means towards an end and not an end in itself.
I mean, that's really what you're talking about, this new roadmap, which is tremendous achievement, by the way. It's brilliant. And you've got 400 other economists. It was a real grassroots movement as well. Everyone has been involved. Oxfam has been really involved. And it's great. You're basically tackling this question: how do we end poverty? How do we reduce inequality without treating GDP growth as kind of the only way to do it, the main way to do it? But tell us about the main conclusions of this roadmap and how that builds on your previous work and who's been involved.
Well, I think there are two dimensions to this roadmap. One is the procedural dimension, and the other is the substantive contribution it tries to make. At the procedural level, I think what was interesting was that we could bring together behind this question, this complex question, how to eradicate poverty without counting on growth, a large number of people who very often were working alongside each other without collaborating with one another in order to form what I see as a very strong progressive alliance of NGOs, unions, academic experts, international agencies to basically ensure that governments at last listen about the need not simply to change the indicators, not simply to move beyond GDP, because that is now a battle that I think we've won, but to go beyond growth and to think about solutions to combat poverty and reduce inequalities that do not see growth as a precondition for social progress. So that is one dimension. Now, the roadmap has also a substantive contribution to make, of course, which is to basically enrich the toolbox, the policy toolbox that governments have at their disposal by showing that actually there is a lot that can be done without having to wait for growth. And that's useful both for economies that have already grown a lot in the past and have become obese with a very important ecological footprint as a result. And that is the case for rich countries, OECD countries. And it is useful for countries that are still developing fast, that still pursue growth because they have to invest for the well-being of their population in infrastructure building in particular, but that do so by using the wrong compass of success, accepting that growth can basically destroy the ecosystems, further cross planetary boundaries, allow the inequalities to grow. In the end, growth is achieved at a very high cost to the population. And so the roadmap tries to alert us to the danger of seeing growth as an end in itself rather than as a means to improving well-being. And it is a call essentially to be much more imaginative and to take the measures that we need to take to reduce poverty and inequalities without necessarily going through increase of the GDP, which is the material throughput of the economy to a large extent.
You say that growth has come at the expense or at a high cost for people and for the planet. And I think if we look around the world right now, a lot of people would argue, and I would agree, that globalization has fundamentally failed working class people living in poverty. And I think it's one of the reasons we're seeing this massive lurch to right-wing populism here in Peru, not just now in Colombia, and a lot of other countries in Latin America. How does your roadmap address this failure? How do you propose to fix it?
The rise of far-right populism, which is not limited, of course, to Latin America, is largely the result of people not seeing in their daily lives improvements, despite macroeconomic indicators having improved, and despite politicians boasting that they have been successful in growing the economy. At root, the problem of far-right populism is linked to the fear people have that they are falling behind, that they are not benefiting from general progress. And even when their material conditions are stable or even slightly improving, if they see that the gaps between the rich and the poor are increasing at the same time, they feel abandoned, they feel neglected, they feel that they are not taken seriously by governments and not listened to. And that is, I think, at heart a problem of democracy. It was very striking to me when I listened to the excellent people who were brought together under the auspices of the International Panel on Inequality that was launched in March of this year, that the economists were mostly concerned about the impacts on democracy of the growth of inequalities, of the inequality emergency. And that is, I think, the main message that comes out from the G20 Extraordinary Committee on Global Inequality, chaired by Joe Stiglitz and Jayati Ghosh, on this topic at the request of the South African presidency of the G20. So inequalities are a threat to our ability to move in a more sustainable direction. It's a threat to our ability to achieve an ecological transformation, but it's also a threat to democracy. And the two are increasingly connected because those who are gaining from the current system, the ultra-rich and the most powerful corporations, veto change that could go against their interests, and they do so by capturing the political system. So I think it is this that we are seeing, and we therefore need to see growth as it has been pursued until now as a recipe for disaster. Not only is there no such thing as green growth that does not increase the metabolism of the economy, more growth necessarily means more resource use, more waste and pollution, including greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. But it also means more inequalities unless we very carefully manage the way we want to develop the economy.
Can I ask a follow-up on that one? So one thing we've noticed, even inside Oxfam, is that, there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm and support for kind of, what's commonly known as degrowth in European circles in particular. Particularly our Northern European Oxfams are very, very excited about it. But then when you go to kind of other parts of the world, and not just the global south, but other rich countries, nothing like the kind of recognition and understanding. Did you find in your kind of country visits and your kind of discussions a bit of a schism emerging between progressives on the one side who would agree with many of these things but struggle with the concept of degrowth and others? Or did you start to see a kind of a synergy between them? And what do you think we can do to make sure that we're all pushing in the same direction?
It's a hugely complicated matter for a number of reasons. And the first one is that whereas there's a consensus within the scientific community that rich countries need to shrink the metabolism of the economy, in other terms, the material throughput of the economy, the amount of resource and energy that they consume in order to remain within planetary boundaries, that kind of degrowth in the material sense of the word will necessarily have an impact on countries in the global south that depend on infinite growth in the north in order to develop themselves. In other terms, one major problem we face is that although there's a consensus that we need to shrink the economy in the rich countries and grow the economy in developing countries, the two are very closely connected so that it's difficult to achieve both at the same time unless we gradually disconnect development in the global south from infinite growth in the global north. And that is part of what the roadmap that we presented in Geneva on 22nd of April tries to do. It's to show how we can gradually, not overnight, but gradually disconnect development in the global south from growth in the global north to avoid a form of growth in the global south that is export driven. Because that is, I think, a major problem, explaining that today most of the growth in the global south is the result of the extraction of resources for consumers in the global north and the exploitation of cheap workforce for global supply chains. And that is something that is not sustainable. The second reason why this is a very complicated question is because, of course, we have been for many years challenging austerity policies imposed on populations in the global north in the name of, fiscal balance and the reduction of public deficits in order to calm down the financial markets and to ensure the sustainability of the public debt. And therefore, I believe we should really move beyond the growth, degrowth debate. When we speak about post-growth, we mean that GDP increase should not distract us from the key objectives of improving well-being, of combating poverty, of reducing inequality, of ensuring that people all are able to lead a decent life. And the degrowth debate is one that is important from the macroeconomic perspective, but is not directly relevant to people's lives. How people are able or not to lead decent lives depends only marginally from that macroeconomic indicator that governments still very much use as a compass of success of their policies. But so these are the complications we try to address in the roadmap. Essentially, what we are saying here is we need to use the scarce resources we have at our disposal in the most efficient way possible by prioritizing the satisfaction of basic needs, healthcare, education, quality housing, mobility needs, and so forth. And we need to avoid the choices being made in the economy based only on the desires expressed by the richest parts of the population with the purchasing power they have. Because that is, I think, the major problem we have, is that in a capitalist economy, most choices as to what to produce, at which conditions, and by whom are driven by considerations related to where profits can be maximized for the benefit of shareholders. And that is not, of course, the same thing than to direct the economy towards satisfying the basic needs of people in poverty. So we need to redirect the economy, to move to a mission economy, if you wish, that prioritizes the satisfaction of needs of people in poverty and not the desires expressed by the richest parts of the population who can command the use of scarce resources for their benefit.
I want to go back to something you mentioned a bit earlier about how people are feeling left behind. And we're seeing now that the gap between the billionaire class and the rest of humanity has reached unprecedented, dangerous heights. Now we have the world's first trillionaire. How does your roadmap propose to end or dismantle this concentration of extreme wealth and power, or claw it back? What gives you hope that we can reclaim our public future?
Yes, well, the roadmap has in total 6 pillars. The first one is economic systems transformation, and under this very vague and pretentious title, we refer to a number of reforms that should be made to the way public services are financed and public and social protection is financed. And in particular, we explore how taxation can be reformed to reduce inequalities, to focus on wealth rather than only income, and to combat extreme wealth concentration, which, as we said earlier, is becoming a democratic issue and not simply a problem for the economy. So the roadmap makes these proposals that are premised, of course, on the willingness of governments to make the bold changes that it would require to combat these gross inequalities. I think there's an awareness rising amongst governments that we need to do something more. We often see international cooperation as a precondition for decisive action to be taken by governments in this regard. And this is why, for example, negotiations have been launched on the new United Nations Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation, which is important, but I don't think it should be seen as a precondition. Governments can do much more than they seem to be willing to confess by themselves, unilaterally. For example, by taxing the wealth of the, centimillionaires or the billionaires over which they can exercise jurisdiction because these millionaires or billionaires have their nationality. And even if those billionaires threaten to leave the country, that does not mean that they cannot be subject to certain obligations. Just like you may be forced to serve in the military because you have the nationality of a particular country, even if you choose to reside outside that country. So I think there is much that can be done without waiting for everyone to agree and without having a consensus across a large part of the international community about certain rules having to change. But I do acknowledge fully that question of financing public services and social protection is at the heart of the challenge of moving to a more sustainable economy. And this is why the different proposals in the roadmap are very interdependent. Some proposals concern the financing issue. Other proposals concern universal basic services, reduction of working time, the democratization of the strategic decisions within the companies, and so on. And so we should see the roadmap as a toolkit in which the different elements and policy proposals are mutually supportive and mutually dependent.
In the last month, we've had your amazing roadmap, and then we've had this global justice report also from the team in Paris. Both exciting in that they're laying out a kind of positive vision for a better world, and one that is much more equal but also lives within planetary boundaries. But, okay, it's just a challenge. Isn't that socialism?
I think the work done in the Global Justice Report by the World Inequality Lab, which is remarkable, and the roadmap on eradicating poverty beyond growth that we have led within the UN system are very complementary. And we had many exchanges between us identifying the very strong overlaps between the two. What they have in common is indeed, and this is why the term socialism is certainly justified, a call for governments to reclaim control over the trajectory of the economy, rather than leaving this to the blind operation of markets in a purely evolutionary perspective. It is perhaps not by chance that these reports are being presented at a time when we are starting to negotiate the new generation of development goals for the period 2030-2045. The SDG summit of 2027 will be a major moment in this regard. And I think these reports should be seen as opening up a conversation that will allow the more progressive governments and the more progressive parts of, the UN system, the UN agencies, to put forward proposals, knowing that they have the backing of NGOs, of unions, of academic experts, that all these scenarios have been tested and often quantified, costs calculated. And now it is for governments to pick up the glove, as it were, and to ensure that they meet up these expectations. The next step, I think, is to make sure that the work done by the Global Justice Report, by the roadmap on eradicating poverty beyond growth, and by the International Panel on Inequality work on their complementarities, mutually support each other, refer to one another in order to show that there's a very strong consensus despite certain differences in emphasis and in priorities, and of course in methodologies, in order to ensure that governments are not allowed to ignore what is in those different contributions. Very clearly, in 2027, 2029, when the new development goals will be negotiated, there will be a very difficult bargaining round taking place, and civil society must organize, especially in the context of the rise of far-right populism and the capture of the political system by the oligarchs and the largest corporations. So it's a battle. In this battle, I think the intellectual ammunition we can provide does matter, and we have to be ready for this battle. This is what the roadmap is ultimately all about. It's about equipping the progressive movements across the world with tools that have credibility and have been the result of a very participatory process, giving them legitimacy.
I agree. I think you've done a fantastic job of that, Olivier, and you should be congratulated. I think people are mobilized by ideas, and they're also mobilized by a positive vision for the future, not just a description of what's not working. And I think you've achieved both those things. So one thing I didn't ask you about, I was curious what, what's your reflections on what kind of AI means for all of this? How much did that come up in all of your consultations, and how much do you think, is it just another example of how, we need to have more democratic control of capital, or is it a completely unprecedented situation to your mind?
I think the sense of powerlessness that governments have is the result of two processes on which they believe they have no control. The first one is globalization. In other terms, the lowering of barriers to trade and investment, which is the result of technological developments, of cultural evolutions, but also, of course, of legal changes and political choices in the form of free trade agreements and investment agreements that have facilitated globalization for economic actors. So we need to make governments aware that globalization is a political choice, and the shape it takes depends on the choices they make. And the second driving force is technology. To a large extent, governments are acting today as if technological development were something inevitable, written in the skies or in the stars, over which they have no control. And ultimately, we have a relationship to technology which is similar to that of the dog to his master. We just follow it and we try to adapt to it. And I think AI is a good illustration of this. It is presented mostly as something that is inevitably going to govern our lives, and not only our lives at work, but also our intimate relationships. And that is, of course, not only scary, but it's also wrong, because we could domesticate AI to make it something that serves humanity rather than something something that enslaves humanity. But again, it is a choice we have to make as to how we want to use or not AI, in which context, and how to regulate it. And the roadmap is going to continue to live. We will regularly update the proposals and prepare briefs on certain emerging topics, and we will prepare one on AI, relating it to the different policy proposals that are made in the roadmap.
That was really interesting discussion. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was an interesting discussion. Max, I've known you to be a bit skeptical about degrowth. I think you'd say that's fair. So I'm curious to know, what did you think about what Olivier said?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I do definitely think that rich countries need to, at least large chunks of rich country economies need to stop growing to save the planet. But I do really worry about the impacts that would have on the global south. And I do think it is really important, particularly when you've lived and worked in some of the poorest countries, they really do need significant economic growth. They need growth in people's incomes. But Olivier was really eloquent on that, I thought. He was very clear that this is about slowing down the growth in the rich world and to create the space to increase prosperity in the global south, which many people do say. But he went on and he was very clear that we need to do that slowly, because at the moment, the whole global economy is so wired into global south countries providing things that then are consumed in the rich countries of the global north. So if they suddenly stop consuming all those things, it would have an enormous negative impact. I thought what he said about kind of decoupling the global south economies and enabling them to stand on their own 2 feet was really convincing, to be honest. Yeah. So anyway, how about you?
I thought it was really interesting when he talked about tax and how it can be a really important tool to reduce inequality, and that we shouldn't focus only on income, but rather on wealth to tackle extreme wealth concentration, and how, we have some interesting initiatives like the UN Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation, which is important. It's great. But also that individual countries don't have to wait until these kinds of negotiations, which take time, come to fruition, that they can decide to do things on their own. They can decide to implement a wealth tax, an inheritance tax, digital taxes. There are a lot of options. And I also thought it was interesting how he said, billionaires, even if they can threaten to leave the country. But not long ago, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, our friends at Tax Justice Network actually said, this isn't even true. There was this report that was widely covered in the news around the world for its claims about a global millionaire exodus. And this study was actually used by some governments to water down taxes on the super rich. And the study has had to acknowledge that this millionaire migration is at best modest, and they dropped the only author. So, I think it's important that we keep breaking down these myths about taxing the rich. And I think it's one of the, as Olivier said, it's not only something that has to do with the economy, but it's something that has to do with democracy and inequality.
Yeah, I agree. He was agreeing. He was really good on that governments, of course, we need global agreements on things, but governments mustn't wait for those, and there's lots that they can do. So, yeah, really, really hopeful and very practical as well, I thought, and very persuasive. So, quite a high bar for the next one. So, the next one is the Global Justice Report from Thomas Piketty and the team at the World Inequality Lab. And we interviewed Thomas just before Christmas. So, this time we're going to interview 3 of the lead researchers on the report. So, that's exciting. And that's coming up in a couple of weeks, covering very similar topics, but with slightly different perspectives and takes on how we can build a world that's more equal, where poverty is eliminated, and we save the planet from climate breakdown. So, looking forward to that one too. So thanks everybody for joining and listening, and do tune in next time.
Yes, and also be sure to follow us on social media, on X, Blue Sky, and subscribe to our Substack at equals.ink. Tell your friends, and see you soon.
See you soon. Cheers, everyone.